Hello everyone, welcome to the Story Tales, your place for the best horror stories. For the next hour, I want you to put on your earphones, put your phone face down, and close your eyes. Relax, and let this story take you to a world full of chills and mystery. I've been listening to horror stories for years, and now I'm here to share the most amazing ones with you. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. It all began when my boss, Mr. Harris, assigned me to inspect a decrepit old house at the far end of Maplewood, a small town that always seemed shrouded in an unspoken gloom. The house was called the Blakewood Manor. It had been abandoned for decades, left to decay, and was now on the verge of collapsing, or so I had been told. My job was to assess the building and figure out if it could be salvaged. Mr. Harris gave me the address and a warning. "Be careful in the attic," he said, his voice unusually serious. I laughed it off. "Old houses make strange noises, right?" I joked, trying to lighten the mood. He didn't laugh. Instead, he simply said, "Just don't linger too long up there," before walking away. The day I arrived, the weather matched the house's mood. Thick gray clouds loomed overhead, and a biting wind tugged at my jacket as I parked my truck. I stood on the gravel driveway, staring at the house. It was a towering structure, 3 stories tall, with cracked walls and windows that seemed to glare back at me like watchful eyes. The roof sagged in places, shingles missing like gaps in a worn smile. The wooden front door hung slightly crooked, its paint peeling in long, curling strips. A rusted mailbox sat near the entrance, untouched for years. I glanced down at my clipboard and sighed. "Let's get this over with," I muttered, heading inside. The moment I stepped through the door, the air seemed to change. It was heavy, stale, and carried a faint scent of something rotten. The floor creaked beneath my boots, and the walls were discolored with years of neglect. Faint water stains formed strange patterns on the ceiling, and cobwebs draped the corners like forgotten curtains. I began my inspection, jotting down notes as I walked through the first floor. The main hallway was lined with faded wallpaper, its floral patterns barely visible under layers of grime. A chandelier hung precariously from the ceiling, its crystals dull and coated with dust. The kitchen was worse. The sink was full of rust, and the counters were covered in a layer of dirt that had solidified over time. I noted the cracked tiles and broken cabinets before moving on. The living room had a fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in decades. Above it hung a large, crooked painting of a man and woman, their faces stern and emotionless. The man's eyes seemed to follow me as I moved, but I shook off the feeling. Just a trick of the light, I told myself. As I finished my notes for the ground floor, my thoughts turned to the attic. The house had already shown plenty of issues: leaking ceilings, rotting wood, and structural instability. I wasn't looking forward to what I might find up there, but it was part of the job. At the end of the hallway, I found the narrow door Mr. Harris had mentioned. The handle was rusted, and the wood felt soft and spongy as I turned it. Behind the door, a steep wooden staircase spiraled upward, disappearing into darkness. I hesitated for a moment, staring into the black void above. A faint draft blew down the stairs, carrying the scent of mothballs and something else I couldn't quite place. It was faint, like damp fabric or old cardboard left to rot. "Just another attic," I muttered, gripping my flashlight. I started climbing. The stairs groaned under my weight, each step sounding like a protest. Dust hung in the air, catching the beam of my flashlight. The higher I went, the darker it became, the faint light from the hallway below disappearing entirely. When I reached the top, I paused on the last step, shining my flashlight into the attic. It was enormous, larger than I expected, with a low slanting ceiling that made the space feel cramped despite its size. The wooden rafters above were thick with cobwebs, and the floor was covered in a mix of dust, debris, and what looked like dead insects. Boxes were stacked against the walls, their edges softened by layers of dust. Old furniture, chairs, tables, and a dresser with one drawer missing was scattered around haphazardly. The faint beam of light from a grimy window at the far end barely illuminated the room, leaving most of it shrouded in shadows. The air was thick, almost suffocating. Every breath felt like I was inhaling years of forgotten decay. I took a cautious step forward, my boots crunching on something brittle. I scanned the room with my flashlight, making mental notes about the water stains on the walls and the condition of the wooden beams. But as I moved further in, I heard a sound, a faint scraping noise coming from the corner of the attic. I froze, my heart racing. "Probably a rat," I whispered, trying to convince myself. I aimed my flashlight toward the sound, but the beam only revealed more dust and shadows. Nothing moved. I forced myself to keep walking, telling myself I was imagining things. But then it came again, louder this time. A soft, scratchy laugh that sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't a normal laugh. It was high-pitched, almost childlike, but with an edge that made my skin crawl. It lasted for only a second or two before cutting off abruptly. I spun around, my flashlight shaking slightly in my hand. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cracking. The attic swallowed the sound, leaving only silence. For a moment I stood there, paralyzed. My logical mind told me it was just the wind or some quirk of the old house. But a part of me, the part that felt the hairs on the back of my neck standing up, knew something wasn't right. Deciding to finish quickly, I moved toward the far end of the attic, my flashlight flickering as I walked. The room grew darker, the weak light from the window fading as I moved further away. That's when I saw them. 4 masks hanging from nails on a wooden shelf. They were grotesque, each one twisted into a bizarre expression. The first had bulging eyes and a gaping mouth, as if frozen mid-scream. The second wore a crooked grin, its smile unnervingly wide. The third had sunken cheeks and a downturned mouth, its face filled with despair. And the fourth, its wide, round eye holes seemed to stare right at me, unblinking. I felt a cold draft brush the back of my neck, and a shiver ran through me. The masks looked handmade, their surfaces rough and cracked. The paint was chipped, giving them an even more unsettling appearance. I stepped closer, unable to look away. My flashlight beam steadied on the masks, and for a moment, I swore I saw something move inside the hollow eyes. "Just the shadows," I whispered, but my voice lacked conviction. The laughter came again, louder this time, echoing through the attic. I spun around, my flashlight darting across the room. But there was nothing, only the masks hanging silently on the shelf, as if mocking me. For the first time in years, I felt genuine fear, and I hadn't even begun to understand the nightmare that was about to unfold. My breath was shallow, quick. The beam of my flashlight trembled in my hand as I stared at the 4 masks, each one hanging from the shelf like grotesque sentinels. The laughter that echoed through the attic, though faint at first, was now louder, sharper, closer. It had been soft at first, as though someone were trying to play a trick, but now it sounded too real, too unsettling. The masks. They were unsettling, their hollow eyes staring at me from their nails. The laugh had sounded like it was coming from the shadows near them. I had convinced myself it was the wind, a draft, a part of the house settling after years of neglect. But that was a lie. Something was wrong. Something wasn't right in this house. And that something seemed to be hidden in the attic, just waiting for me to uncover it. I stood there, paralyzed for a moment, as the laughter subsided and the attic returned to its suffocating silence. My heart thudded loudly in my chest, each beat like a drum, echoing in my ears. I blinked rapidly, trying to clear the images and thoughts that scrambled through my mind. The wind, the masks, the laugh. Get a grip, I muttered under my breath, trying to shake the sense of dread that had started to settle in my stomach like a stone. I took a step back and forced myself to look at the wooden beams above, anything to get my mind off the masks. The rafters were old, dusty, and covered in cobwebs. I scanned the walls for any signs of rot or cracks, anything that would require my immediate attention. My job was to inspect the structure, to be methodical, to finish and report back to Mr. Harris. But as I moved further into the attic, I felt it again, the prickling sensation at the back of my neck, like I was being watched. No matter how hard I tried to dismiss it, the feeling wouldn't go away. Another laugh, this one higher, almost squeaky, echoed from the far corner of the attic. It wasn't the laugh of a person, but more of an inhuman, mocking sound, a distorted voice that sent a chill running up my spine. My hands clenched the flashlight tighter, my pulse racing. The beam of light cut through the darkness, and I directed it toward the corner where the laugh had come from. Nothing. Nothing at all. I took a cautious step forward, my boots crunching on something brittle, maybe dead insects or decayed wood. My flashlight beam wavered over the stacks of boxes, the piles of forgotten furniture. Everything was covered in dust, old and forgotten, left to rot. I moved toward the farthest corner, toward the darkened space where the laugh had echoed. My mind screamed at me to turn around, to leave, but I ignored it. I had to finish my inspection. As I reached the corner, the flashlight beam danced across old, broken furniture. A wooden chair tipped over, a table with one leg bent awkwardly, and a stack of crates. But there was something else, something that made my skin crawl. A shadow. It wasn't cast by the light from my flashlight. It was something more. I swung the beam around expecting to find the source of the shadow, but all I saw were more shadows. The entire attic was filled with them, each one stretching in strange ways that didn't seem natural. They seemed to move with me, as if the dark corners of the room were alive, watching, following my every movement. I took a few hesitant steps toward the shelves at the back wall, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease gnawing at my insides. My flashlight flickered as I moved, and for a brief moment, I could have sworn I saw one of the masks twitch. It was quick, just a subtle shift, but it was enough to send my heart into overdrive. No, I whispered to myself. It's just your mind playing tricks. I tried to focus on the task at hand, to push the terror clawing at my chest into the farthest corners of my mind. But the laugh came again, this time from behind me. It was a high-pitched, squeaky giggle, full of malice and mockery, as if whatever it was knew I was terrified. I spun around, my flashlight whipping across the attic, but again there was nothing. Nothing except the boxes, the dusty furniture, the abandoned relics of a past long forgotten. My heart hammered in my chest, and I took several quick, shallow breaths to calm myself. I've been in worse places, I muttered. I've seen worse things. But even as I said the words, I wasn't so sure. This felt different. The air in the attic was thick, heavy with a kind of tension that seemed to press against my chest. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet, and I was acutely aware of every sound, every movement. I was alone, completely alone. But the attic didn't feel empty. I forced myself to turn away from the shelves with the masks and scan the rest of the attic. It was as if the space itself was alive, and it was waiting for me to slip up. My flashlight flickered again, and I quickly shook it to make the beam steady. I took another step forward, carefully stepping over piles of old furniture, trying to avoid tripping. My eyes kept drifting back to the masks on the shelf, those terrible twisted faces, their hollow eyes watching me. But then, I saw something else. A wooden chest, half buried under a stack of old blankets. It was weathered, the wood dark and cracked, but something about it called to me. A strange compulsion tugged at me, urging me to open it. I walked over, my hands trembling slightly as I reached down to lift the lid. The chest creaked, and I winced. A cloud of dust poured out from the seams as the lid swung open. Inside, I found old papers, yellowed with age, and a few odd trinkets, a broken pocket watch, a rusted key, and a doll. The doll was old, its face cracked, with one eye missing. Its hair was matted and dirty, and it wore a tattered dress. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I stared at it. I didn't know why, but something about the doll was wrong. There was a heaviness to it, a malevolent presence that made me want to put it down and walk away. But my curiosity got the better of me. I picked it up, turning it over in my hands. That's when I saw it. Etched into the back of the doll's head was a symbol. It was faint, worn down by years of neglect, but it was unmistakable, a symbol I didn't recognize, but that felt familiar. I shuddered, dropping the doll back into the chest and quickly shutting the lid. My stomach churned, and I could feel my heartbeat pounding in my throat. The air around me had grown colder, and the shadows seemed to grow longer, stretching toward me like fingers reaching out of the darkness. Okay, that's enough, I whispered to myself. I'm done here. But as I turned to leave, I heard the laugh again. Only this time, it wasn't from behind me. It was right beside me. I spun around, my flashlight swinging wildly. The beam cut through the darkness, landing on the shelf with the masks. They were all gone. My stomach lurched. The masks were no longer hanging from their nails. They were missing, and as my flashlight danced across the room, I saw them. They were no longer on the shelf, no longer against the wall. They were in the room with me, scattered across the floor, positioned in strange, unnatural ways. Some were facing me, their hollow eyes watching, while others were turned away, their twisted expressions seeming to mock me. I felt a cold sweat break out across my back, and my breathing became shallow and rapid. The laugh came again. This time it was full of glee, like a child who had won a game. The sound echoed, bouncing off the walls, making it impossible to tell where it was coming from. I turned and ran. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The air seemed to thicken around me, pressing in on me as I sprinted down the stairs and out of the attic. My footsteps echoed in the hall, the sound bouncing around the empty house like a haunting refrain. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, I glanced over my shoulder. The attic door was still open, but there was nothing there, nothing but the darkness. I wasn't sure if it was the house playing tricks on me, or if something else was inside. But I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going back up there. I didn't even bother closing the attic door as I rushed out of the house. My truck was parked in the driveway, but I couldn't bring myself to leave just yet. My hands were shaking as I leaned against the side of my vehicle, trying to calm myself. The sound of laughter echoed in my ears. I couldn't shake it. I couldn't shake the feeling that something in that house was waiting, watching, and it was waiting for me to return. I sat in my truck, the engine idling as the wind howled around the property. My hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, but I couldn't drive away. Not yet. Something about the house wouldn't let me go. The laughter, the masks, the oppressive darkness of the attic. They had etched themselves into my mind. What had I stumbled into? The rational part of me screamed to leave, to abandon the inspection and forget this house ever existed. But the gnawing feeling of unfinished business weighed me down. What if someone else entered that house? What if whatever was in there harmed them? I couldn't shake the image of those masks, scattered across the attic floor watching me. And the laughter. It still echoed in my ears like a taunt, daring me to come back. I slammed my hands against the steering wheel, frustration and fear boiling over. "Get it together," I muttered. "You're not a coward." The house loomed in the distance, its silhouette dark against the cloudy sky. It felt alive, like it was watching me. A shiver ran down my spine as I turned off the truck and stepped back onto the gravel driveway. The wind seemed to die down, the air suddenly heavy and still. I didn't want to go back, but I had to. I grabbed a crowbar from the truck bed, a poor excuse for a weapon, but it was better than nothing. With the flashlight tucked under my arm, I marched back toward the house, forcing my fear down with every step. The front door creaked as I pushed it open, the sound reverberating through the empty space. The house felt colder now, the air thick with a strange, musty smell that wasn't there before. My boots echoed against the wooden floor as I made my way back to the attic stairs. Each step felt like a journey into the unknown, every shadow a potential threat. When I reached the attic door, I hesitated. The opening yawned before me, the darkness inside seeming to pulse, alive and aware. My flashlight beam flickered as I stepped inside, the floorboards groaning under my weight. "Okay," I whispered to myself, gripping the crowbar tightly. "Just find out what's going on and get out." The attic was silent now, the laughter replaced by an almost deafening stillness. The air felt colder, heavier, and every breath was like inhaling ice. My flashlight cut through the darkness, landing on the shelf where the masks had hung. They were still gone, scattered across the floor where I had seen them last. But something was different. The masks were no longer still. They were closer. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The masks had shifted. Their positions changed as though they had moved on their own. One was perched atop a pile of boxes, its hollow eyes fixed directly on me. Another leaned against a broken chair, its twisted grin wide and mocking. A soft, childlike giggle broke the silence, echoing from the far end of the attic. I whipped the flashlight in its direction, the beam shaking as I tried to steady my hand. The giggle came again, louder this time, and then I saw it. A shadow darting between the stacks of old furniture. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice shaky but firm. "Show yourself." The only response was the sound of movement, soft and deliberate, like footsteps across the dusty floor. My heart pounded as I edged closer to the source of the noise, the crowbar raised in my trembling hand. The flashlight beam landed on a corner of the attic where a small figure stood. It was a child, or at least it looked like one. The figure was tiny, no taller than a 10-year-old, but its features were obscured by a mask, one of the same grotesque masks I had seen earlier. Its hollow eyes glowed faintly, and it tilted its head to the side as though studying me. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it raised one hand, pointing toward the chest I had opened earlier. I followed its gesture, my flashlight landing on the chest. The lid was slightly open now, the items inside barely visible. A chill ran down my spine as I turned back to the figure, but it was gone. Panic bubbled in my chest as I scanned the attic, searching for any sign of movement. The masks were still scattered across the floor, their hollow eyes staring at me, mocking me. The laughter started again, louder this time, echoing from all around me. "What do you want?" I shouted, my voice cracking. The laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by a low, guttural voice. "You shouldn't have come." I spun around, the flashlight beam catching another figure, a second masked child, this one taller, its posture unnervingly stiff. Behind it, more figures began to emerge, stepping out from the shadows. Each one wore a mask, their expressions frozen in grotesque glee or despair. They surrounded me, their movements slow and deliberate. My breath hitched as I gripped the crowbar tighter, backing toward the attic stairs. The air grew colder, the oppressive atmosphere pressing down on me. "You don't belong here," the guttural voice continued, though none of the figures moved their mouths. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "I was just doing my job," I said, my voice trembling. "I didn't mean to disturb anything." The figures stopped, their hollow eyes fixed on me. For a moment, The room was silent again, the tension so thick it felt like I couldn't breathe. Then the tallest figure stepped forward, its mask twisted into a cruel grin. "You woke us," it said. "You let us in." The words sent a chill through me, and I felt a surge of panic. "I didn't wake anything," I shouted. "I didn't—" But then I remembered the chest, the doll, the strange symbol etched into its head. "Why are you here?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The tallest figure tilted its head, as though considering my question. "We are bound to this place, to the masks, to the chest. You opened it. You released us." My stomach dropped. I had been the one to disturb them, to break whatever seal had kept them trapped. "What do you want?" I asked again, desperation creeping into my voice. "To be free," the figure said. "But first, you must pay the price." Before I could react, the figures surged forward, their movements sudden and unnatural. I swung the crowbar wildly, but it passed through them like smoke. Their laughter filled the attic, a cacophony of voices that seemed to rattle the very walls. I stumbled backward, my flashlight falling from my hand and rolling across the floor. Darkness closed in around me as the figures loomed closer, their masks glowing faintly in the dim light. "Please," I begged, my voice cracking. "I didn't mean to disturb you. I'll fix it. I'll put everything back." The laughter stopped, and the tallest figure leaned down, its mask inches from my face. "You cannot undo what has been done, but you can take our place." My heart froze. "What do you mean?" "You will wear the mask," the figure said. "You will stay here, bound to this place, until another takes your place." "No!" I shouted, scrambling backward. "I won't—" But before I could finish, the figure pressed one of the masks into my hands. It was cold and heavy, its surface rough against my skin. The hollow eyes seemed to bore into me, pulling me in. I tried to resist, to fight back, but my body wouldn't listen. My hands moved on their own, lifting the mask toward my face. The air around me grew colder, and the shadows seemed to close in, wrapping around me like a shroud. The last thing I saw before the darkness consumed me was the row of masks on the shelf, their hollow eyes watching as I became one of them. When the realtor arrived the next day to check on the property, they found the attic empty. The masks were back on the shelf, hanging in their original places. But there was something new. A fifth mask, its expression frozen in a silent scream. And from the shadows of the attic, a faint, high-pitched laugh echoed, waiting for the next visitor. The Harper mansion stood like a forgotten sentinel at the edge of town. Its once pristine facade was now a tapestry of peeling paint and vines that seemed to claw their way up the walls. The mansion's history was murky. Rumors swirled about strange disappearances and whispers of a fire that had gutted part of the building decades ago. None of it mattered to me when I took the renovation job. I was there to inspect the attic and provide a structural report. Easy work, or so I thought. The manager, Mr. Wells, was a wiry man with a constant nervous energy. He handed me the clipboard, his eyes darting around the empty lobby. "Remember," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "nobody goes up to the attic except you. It's part of the deal." I raised an eyebrow. "Why? What's the big deal with the attic?" He fidgeted with the pen in his hand, avoiding my gaze. "Old stuff, dangerous. Just do what you need to and get out." His evasiveness unsettled me, but I nodded and headed toward the staircase. The steps creaked under my boots as I climbed to the top floor, flashlight in hand. The air grew colder the higher I went, and the hallway leading to the attic seemed unnaturally quiet. The attic door was heavy, the wood darkened with age. I unlocked it with the key Mr. Wells had given me, the latch clicking loudly in the silence. The hinges groaned as I pushed the door open, revealing a steep, narrow staircase leading into darkness. I took a deep breath and climbed. The attic was enormous, its low ceiling crisscrossed with wooden beams. Dust hung thick in the air, illuminated by the narrow beam of my flashlight. Every step stirred up clouds of grime, and the floorboards groaned under my weight. Stacks of old boxes lined the walls, and forgotten furniture lay scattered about. But what caught my eye immediately were the masks. They hung on a wooden beam near the back of the attic, each one carved with intricate, haunting detail. There were 4 of them, their features exaggerated, wide eyes, twisted mouths, expressions frozen in silent screams. One mask, with a gaping mouth and hollow eyes, seemed to follow me as I moved. I shook off the unease and got to work. My job was to inspect the rafters for signs of damage, so I focused on that, documenting areas where the wood had warped or cracked. That's when I felt it, a sharp tug on the bottom of my pant leg. I froze. It wasn't the snag of a loose nail or a stray splinter. It felt deliberate, like a small hand or claw yanking at the fabric. My throat tightened, and I shone my flashlight down, expecting to see a rat or some other animal. But there was nothing. The dusty floor stretched out undisturbed, with only my footprints marking the surface. My boots were the only things in sight. I stood still, straining to hear any movement. The attic was silent except for the faint creak of the rafters and my own unsteady breathing. Sweat beaded on my forehead, and I forced myself to move again, muttering, "It's nothing, just your imagination." But my hands were shaking now. I checked a few more rafters, making notes on the clipboard. Each step felt heavier, the weight of the silence pressing down on me. As I rounded a corner near the back wall, the tug came again, this time weaker, almost playful. I stumbled, jerking my leg away and spinning around, flashlight sweeping the room in a wide arc. For a split second, I saw something. A faint outline of a shape darted near the wall and disappeared behind a large trunk. It flickered in the light like smoke, translucent and quick. My heart pounded as I stared at the trunk, gripping the flashlight so tightly my knuckles turned white. I wanted to leave, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. "Hello?" I called, my voice shaky. No response. I inched toward the trunk, each step echoing in the quiet space. My flashlight beam trembled as I reached out with my free hand and lifted the lid. Inside were old documents, a few torn curtains, and random bits of junk. Nothing unusual. Nothing that could explain what I'd just seen. I closed the trunk, my hands slick with sweat, and stood there for a moment, trying to steady my breathing. That's when I heard it. A scraping sound, soft but deliberate, coming from behind me. I spun around, my flashlight cutting through the shadows. Near the wall, the wooden masks seemed to glint in the dim light. But something was off. Earlier, they had hung in a neat row, evenly spaced. Now, 2 of them were closer together. I stared at them, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. Maybe I'd misremembered their positions. But deep down, I knew better. A dull thud echoed from the far side of the attic. I whipped the flashlight toward the noise and saw a stack of boxes toppling over, scattering old newspapers across the floor. The newspapers slid toward me as though pushed by an invisible breeze. And then I smelled it. A faint, stale odor, like wet cardboard mixed with something sour. My stomach churned as I stepped around the papers, moving cautiously toward the fallen boxes. There was nothing behind them but the wall. No holes, no vents, nothing that could explain the draft. I stood there, my chest tight and my scalp prickling. The attic felt alive. I turned to leave, deciding I'd seen enough for one day. But as I took a step toward the stairs, the tug came again, stronger this time, insistent. "Stop it!" I shouted, kicking my leg out. My voice echoed in the empty space, louder than I intended. The laughter returned. It came from everywhere and nowhere, overlapping voices that were raspy and broken. It wasn't the laughter of children or even adults. It sounded unnatural, like something mimicking laughter without understanding it. Panic set in. I ran for the attic door, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly. The floorboards creaked and shifted under my weight, and I could feel the presence of something behind me. I didn't dare look back. The attic door was still open when I reached it. I nearly tripped on the top step in my haste to descend. The wooden staircase groaned with each hurried step, and the flickering light bulb overhead cast erratic shadows. When I reached the hallway, I slammed the attic door shut and slid the latch into place. My breathing was ragged, my hands trembling as I leaned against the wall. But the silence didn't last. A soft scraping sound came from the other side of the door, like nails scratching wood. I stared at the door, half expecting it to burst open. It didn't. I forced myself to walk down the hallway, each step quick and uneven. My heart was racing, and my mind was a jumble of fear and confusion. By the time I reached the elevator, I could barely hold the clipboard steady in my hands. The old mechanical system hummed faintly as I pressed the button, waiting for the elevator to arrive. The itch at the back of my neck returned, like someone or something was watching me. When the elevator doors opened, I stepped inside quickly and punched the ground floor button. As the doors slid shut, I caught a glimpse of the end of the hallway. The attic door was still latched, but the overhead light flickered again. And for a split second, I thought I saw a mask peeking around the corner. It vanished as quickly as it appeared, and the elevator doors closed, sealing me inside. On the ride down, the stale smell lingered, or maybe I was imagining it. My arms felt heavy, and my shoulders ached from tension. I tapped my foot nervously, counting the seconds until I could leave. When the elevator reached the lobby, I stepped out, my legs unsteady. Mr. Wells was waiting at the reception desk, his expression concerned. "Everything okay? You look pale," he said. I forced a laugh, though it sounded hollow even to me. "Just dusty up there," I replied, avoiding his eyes. He didn't press for details, which I was grateful for. I left the mansion and stood on the sidewalk, taking a deep breath. The late afternoon sun warmed my face, but the feeling of unease clung to me like a shadow. I glanced up at the attic windows, half expecting to see something staring back. The glass was dirty and reflective, showing nothing but the sky. But I couldn't shake the image of that mask, the one with the gaping mouth and hollow eyes. It felt like it was still watching me. The drive back to my apartment was uneventful, but I couldn't shake the lingering tension from my visit to the Harper mansion. Every creak of the car's suspension, every fleeting shadow cast by passing trees made my pulse quicken. By the time I reached my driveway, my nerves were frayed, and I was desperate for the comfort of familiarity. I stepped inside, locking the door behind me with an exaggerated sense of relief. My apartment wasn't much. A small, one-bedroom place with mismatched furniture and a lingering scent of takeout, but it was mine. It felt safe, or at least it usually did. That night, the sense of security evaporated as quickly as it came. The masks. They were all I could think about as I sat on the couch, nursing a beer. Their grotesque features seemed burned into my memory, especially the one with the hollow eyes and gaping mouth. It felt as though they'd followed me, their presence clinging to me like cobwebs. I shook my head and took another sip, trying to dismiss the thought. "It's just your imagination," I muttered. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. As the hours passed, I grew more restless. The faint hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of a dog barking, ordinary noises that normally went unnoticed, now seemed amplified, each one setting me on edge. By midnight, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my laptop and decided to do some research on the Harper mansion. Maybe understanding its history would help me make sense of what had happened. The mansion's history was, unsurprisingly, steeped in tragedy. Built in the early 1900s by a wealthy merchant named Victor Harper, it had once been the pinnacle of opulence in the small town, but in 1925, a fire had ravaged the top floors, claiming the lives of Victor's wife, Eleanor, and their 2 children, Margaret and Samuel. Victor Harper was said to have become a recluse after the fire, refusing to leave the mansion and letting it fall into disrepair. Rumors suggested he had turned to strange rituals in an attempt to communicate with his lost family. By the time he died in 1931, the house had already earned a reputation as a cursed place. The more I read, the colder I felt. One detail stood out above all others. Eleanor Harper had been an artist, and her most notable works were masks. I stared at the screen, my heart sinking. The article included a black and white photo of some of her creations, and though they were blurred and grainy, I recognized them instantly. They were the same masks I'd seen in the attic. My mind raced, piecing together fragments of the story. Had Victor Harper kept the masks as a twisted memorial? Or was there something darker at play? A loud thud jolted me from my thoughts. I froze, my hands hovering over the keyboard. The sound had come from the kitchen, a deliberate, heavy noise like something falling. My pulse quickened as I stood and walked cautiously toward the source. The kitchen was empty, its dim light casting long shadows across the tile floor. Nothing seemed out of place at first glance, but as I stepped closer to the counter, I saw it. A glass had toppled over, rolling to the edge of the counter before coming to a stop. I hadn't touched it. The air felt heavier, like a storm was brewing inside the room. My skin prickled as I backed away, suddenly hyper-aware of how quiet the apartment had become. That's when the laughter started. Soft at first, barely audible, but unmistakable. It was the same broken, rasping laughter I'd heard in the attic. My throat tightened, and I spun around, expecting to see something. But the room was empty. The laughter grew louder, echoing in my ears until it felt like it was coming from inside my own head. I stumbled back, clutching at the countertop for support. "Stop!" I shouted, my voice hoarse. And just like that, it did. The silence that followed was deafening. I stood there, shaking, as the faint smell of dust and something sour filled my nostrils. It was the same smell from the attic, unmistakable and out of place in my apartment. My stomach churned, and I bolted for the bathroom, barely making it in time. After retching until there was nothing left, I leaned against the sink, splashing cold water on my face. My reflection in the mirror looked pale and gaunt, dark circles forming under my eyes. What the hell was happening to me? I staggered back to the living room, desperate for some sense of normalcy. My laptop screen was still glowing, the article about the Harper mansion staring back at me. I shut it with a trembling hand and grabbed my phone. I needed answers. The only person who might know anything was Mr. Wells. It was a long shot, but I dialed his number anyway. The phone rang several times before he picked up, his voice groggy. "This better be important," he muttered. "It is," I said, my voice shaking. "I need to know more about the mansion, about the attic." There was a pause on the other end, and when he spoke again, his tone was wary. "What happened?" I hesitated, unsure of how much to tell him. Something's not right. Those masks up there, what's their story?" He sighed heavily. "I told you not to get too involved. You were just supposed to inspect the place and leave." "I need to know," I pressed. There was another long silence before he finally relented. "The masks belonged to Eleanor Harper. She made them for her children, but after the fire, people say they're cursed, that they hold a piece of her soul or something. I don't know if it's true, but strange things have happened to anyone who spends too much time up there." "Strange things like what?" He hesitated. "Voices, shadows, people feeling like they're being followed. You're not the first to call me after visiting that attic." I gripped the phone tighter. "Why didn't you warn me?" "You wouldn't have believed me," he said simply. "Nobody ever does." Before I could respond, the line went dead. I stared at the phone, my mind racing. If what he said was true, then those masks weren't just relics of the past. They were something more, something dangerous. The rest of the night passed in a haze of fear and exhaustion. I slept fitfully, my dreams filled with shadows and laughter. When I woke the next morning, the sun was streaming through the blinds, but the warmth it brought did little to chase away the unease that had settled over me. I couldn't ignore what was happening. I had to go back to the mansion. The thought filled me with dread, but I knew it was the only way to get answers. This time, I wouldn't be going as an inspector. I'd be going as someone who needed to confront the past, and whatever darkness it held. With a deep breath, I grabbed my gear and headed out. The Harper mansion loomed on the horizon as I approached, its shadow stretching long and dark across the overgrown lawn. I parked my car and stared at the building, my resolve wavering. But I had to do this. Steeling myself, I stepped out of the car and made my way to the front door. The air felt heavy, oppressive, as if the mansion itself was aware of my presence. And as I reached for the door handle, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The Harper mansion loomed before me, its crumbling facade more menacing in the daylight than it had been under the veil of darkness. The sun's rays barely penetrated the thick canopy of trees surrounding the property, casting shifting patterns of light and shadow across the lawn. I hesitated at the threshold, the oppressive silence pressing against my chest like a weight. This wasn't just a haunted house, it was a trap, and I was walking straight into it. But I had no choice. I pushed open the heavy front door, the hinges groaning in protest. The air inside was colder than I remembered, carrying with it the same sour, dusty smell that had invaded my apartment the night before. My footsteps echoed as I made my way to the grand staircase. The house seemed even more lifeless than before, as though the very walls were holding their breath. I climbed the stairs slowly, each step a struggle against the knot of fear tightening in my stomach. By the time I reached the attic door, my palms were slick with sweat. The door stood slightly ajar, just as I'd left it. Taking a deep breath, I pushed it open and stepped inside. The masks greeted me like old friends, their twisted faces frozen in expressions of anguish, glee, and terror. The air felt thicker here, almost like walking through water. I scanned the room, half expecting the hollow laughter to start again. But the attic was eerily silent, the kind of silence that prickled at the edges of my awareness. I approached the table where the masks were displayed, my heart pounding. This time, I examined them more closely, noting the intricate details that Eleanor Harper had carved into each one. These weren't just decorations. They were something far more deliberate. Symbols were etched along the edges, runes and sigils that I couldn't decipher, but felt instinctively were significant. One mask in particular drew my attention, the one with hollow eyes and a gaping mouth. It seemed to watch me, its emptiness pulling at something deep within me. As I reached out to touch it, a sudden gust of wind swept through the attic, slamming the door shut behind me. I jumped, spinning around. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice trembling. There was no response, but the air grew colder, and the faint scent of burning wood tickled my nose. Then, I heard it. The laughter. It started softly, barely audible, but grew louder and more distorted with each passing second. It surrounded me, reverberating off the walls until I couldn't tell where it was coming from. "Stop!" I shouted, clutching my head. The laughter ceased abruptly, replaced by a whispering voice. "You shouldn't have come back." I froze. The voice was faint, barely more than a breath, but it was unmistakable. It wasn't a voice I recognized, yet it carried an air of authority, of menace. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice shaking. There was no response, but the room grew darker, the shadows deepening until they seemed to pulse with life. The masks began to move. At first it was subtle, a twitch here, a shift there, but soon they were writhing, their features contorting into even more grotesque shapes. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. The shadows coalesced in the center of the room, forming a figure. It was humanoid but wrong, its form flickering as though it couldn't fully exist in this world. "Eleanor," I whispered, the realization hitting me like a freight train. The figure tilted its head, its eyes, if they could be called that, glowing faintly in the darkness. "You've disturbed my work," it said, its voice a distorted echo. "I didn't mean to," I stammered. I needed to know what was happening." "You shouldn't have come," it repeated, stepping closer. I backed away, my foot catching on the edge of the table. I stumbled, grabbing onto the nearest mask to steady myself. The moment my fingers touched it, a searing pain shot through my hand. I cried out, dropping the mask, but the pain didn't stop. It spread up my arm, an icy burn that felt like it was burrowing into my very bones. The figure watched, its expression unreadable. "You've bound yourself to them," it said. "Now you must finish what I could not." "What are you talking about?" I gasped, clutching my arm. The figure gestured to the masks. "They are fragments of me, pieces of my soul, shattered by the fire. I tried to save them, my family, but the flames consumed them. All that remains are these echoes." I stared at the masks, horror dawning on me. They weren't just cursed objects. They were alive. "What do you want from me?" I asked. "Complete the ritual," Eleanor said. "Bring us peace, or let us consume you." The shadows pressed closer, the air growing colder with each passing moment. I could feel the weight of their presence, their desperation. "How?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The figure extended a hand, pointing to a symbol etched into the floor. "The fire was only the beginning. You must summon it again, but this time, let it cleanse." The idea of setting fire to the attic, to the masks, filled me with dread. But I knew I didn't have a choice. I grabbed a lighter from my pocket, my hands trembling. The shadows retreated slightly, as though anticipating what was to come. "Do it," Eleanor urged. I hesitated, the flame flickering in my hand. The masks seemed to pulse, their twisted faces almost pleading. "I'm sorry," I whispered. With a deep breath, I lowered the flame to the symbol. The moment the fire touched the floor, it erupted, consuming the room in an instant. The heat was intense, but it didn't burn me. Instead, it seemed to envelop me, washing over me like a tidal wave. The shadows screamed, their distorted forms writhing as the flames engulfed them. The masks cracked and splintered, their grotesque features melting away. And then, silence. When I opened my eyes, I was standing in the middle of the attic. The fire was gone, and so were the masks. The room was empty, save for the faint outline of the symbol on the floor. Eleanor was gone too. The oppressive weight that had hung over the mansion was lifted, replaced by an almost peaceful stillness. I stumbled down the stairs and out the front door, the sunlight blinding after the darkness of the attic. As I looked back at the mansion, it seemed different. The shadows that had once clung to it were gone, leaving it bathed in light. I didn't know what would happen to the house now, but I knew one thing for certain. Whatever darkness had haunted it was finally at rest. I climbed into my car and drove away, the weight of the experience pressing heavily on me. I didn't look back, and I never went near the Harper mansion again. My name is Foster. I'm a truck driver. I've been driving across the country for years now, delivering goods from one place to another. It's a lonely job, but it pays the bills. Sometimes I get tired, really tired, and all I need is a place to rest for a few hours. This story is about one of those times. I had just finished a long delivery in the middle of nowhere. It was late, and my eyes felt like they had sand in them. I needed sleep. The highway stretched on and on, dark and empty. That's when I saw a sign for a motel up ahead. The letters were glowing, but a few were flickering like they couldn't decide whether to stay on or off. I was too tired to care. A bed was all I needed. The motel's parking lot had only a few cars, scattered like forgotten toys. The building itself looked old. The paint was peeling, and the windows were covered in dust. I grabbed my backpack from the truck and headed inside. At the front desk, a woman named Marlene was sitting on a stool, reading a magazine. Marlene looked like she'd seen better days. Her hair was pulled back into a messy bun, and her glasses were smudged. She had a bored expression, like nothing in the world could surprise her anymore. "Need a room," I said, my voice dry from the long drive. Marlene didn't look up right away. She flipped a page, sighed, and finally slid a piece of paper across the counter. $40, she said, her voice flat. I handed over the cash and signed my name. Marlene gave me a key attached to a big metal ring. It felt heavy in my hand, like it belonged to another time. No fancy cards here, just an old-fashioned key. "Room 8, she said. "Down the hall, first door on the left." I nodded and made my way to the room. The hallway smelled like wet carpet, and the lights buzzed above me. Room 8 wasn't much to look at, just a bed with a thin blanket, a small TV, and a bathroom that smelled like bleach. But it was quiet, and that's all I needed. I locked the door, tossed my backpack on the chair, and fell onto the bed without even changing. The mattress was lumpy, but I didn't care. I was asleep within minutes. I don't know how long I slept, but something woke me up. It wasn't a noise. It was more like a feeling, the kind you get when someone is staring at you. My heart was pounding. I sat up and looked around. Everything seemed normal, except the door. It was open, just a little, enough for me to see the hallway light. I was sure I had locked it. My stomach twisted. I got up and walked over to the door. The lock was still turned, but somehow the door had opened. I closed it again, making sure it clicked into place. Then I pushed the chair against the doorknob. It wasn't much, but it made me feel a little safer. The next morning I packed up and left early. Marlene was still at the desk, sipping coffee now. She watched me as I walked out, but didn't say a word. Her eyes were sharp, like she knew something I didn't. I didn't think much of it at the time. I was just glad to be back on the road. But that wasn't the end of it. Later that night, after another long day of driving, I decided to stay at the same motel again. I was too tired to find another place. The parking lot looked even emptier, and the air felt heavy, like a storm was coming. When I got to room 8, my heart sank. The door was open again, just like before. I stepped inside, my eyes scanning every corner. Nothing seemed out of place. My bag was where I left it. The bed was still messy from when I had slept in it. But the door kept bothering me. I checked the lock again. It was fine. I told myself it must be loose or broken. But deep down, I didn't believe it. That night, I barely slept. Every sound made me jump. The creak of the floor, the hum of the air conditioner, even the distant rumble of cars on the highway. It all felt too loud, too close. In the morning, I packed up fast, ready to leave. Marlene was outside this time, leaning against the wall. She didn't smile. She didn't speak. She just watched me with those same sharp eyes. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Room 8's door was open again. Just a little. I didn't go back, and I never will. Some places aren't meant to feel like home. Some places are just wrong, and I think that motel was one of them. My name is Wesley, but everyone just calls me Wes. I'm 16 years old and I live in a quiet little town in North Carolina. Not much happens here. The streets are empty after sundown. and the loudest thing you hear at night is the croaking of frogs or the rustling of leaves. My best friend, Emmett, and I have spent almost every summer exploring this place. Emmett's a year older than me. He's the adventurous one, always pushing us to explore deeper into the woods or bike farther than we should. We both live in the same neighborhood, where the houses are spaced out and surrounded by thick trees. The roads are long and winding, perfect for riding our bikes late at night. We'd bike around for hours, pretending we were explorers in some uncharted land. It felt like the whole world belonged to us when it got dark. But there's something I'll never forget, something that made us stop riding those roads after dark. It happened last summer. It was a sticky, hot night in late July, the kind of night where the air feels thick and everything smells like grass and rain. Emmett had shown up at my window just after 10, tapping quietly like he always did. "One last ride," he whispered. "I found a new trail that cuts through the old quarry. We gotta see it before the rain comes tomorrow." I hesitated. The quarry was on the edge of town, close to a stretch of woods that people called Tanner's Hollow. There were stories about that place, stories about people getting lost, hearing strange sounds, and seeing lights that didn't make sense. But Emmett grinned, his green eyes sparkling in the moonlight. He knew I'd never say no. We grabbed our bikes and took off, the wheels humming against the pavement. The streets were empty, as always, and the only light came from the flickering street lamps. We didn't talk much as we rode, letting the sound of the wind and the crickets fill the silence. By the time we reached the trail leading to the quarry, the moon was high and bright. The trees cast long shadows on the ground, and everything felt still, too still. "You sure about this?" I asked, glancing at Emmett. "Relax, Wes," he said, already pushing his bike onto the dirt path. "We'll be in and out. Just a quick loop." The trail was narrow, winding between tall pines and thick bushes. The deeper we went, the darker it got. Our bike lights flickered, casting strange shapes on the ground. But Emmett didn't slow down. He never did. About a mile in, we reached a clearing. The quarry stretched out in front of us, a giant pit filled with still water. The surface shimmered under the moonlight, like a mirror. "See? Worth it," Emmett said, parking his bike. We stood there for a while, listening to the night. Then, just as I was about to suggest heading back, I saw it, a light on the far side of the quarry. At first, I thought it was someone with a flashlight, but the way it moved was wrong. It wasn't steady. It pulsed and flickered, like it was dancing. Then, it split into two, then three, each light moving in a different direction. "Emmett, look," I whispered. He followed my gaze, his face going pale. "What is that?" "I don't know," I said, my voice shaky. The lights kept moving, faster now, weaving patterns that made my head spin. Then came the sound, a low hum, so faint it was almost like a vibration in my chest. Emmett grabbed my arm. "We need to go, now." We jumped on our bikes and pedaled as fast as we could, the trail blurring around us, but the lights didn't stay behind. They followed us, flickering through the trees, growing brighter and closer. We hit the main road, gasping for breath. For a moment, I thought we were safe. But then I heard it, the roar of engines. Headlights appeared behind us, cutting through the dark. Four-wheelers and dirt bikes, their riders dressed in black. They didn't shout or honk. They just came, fast and silent. "Go, go, go!" Emmett shouted. We turned onto a side road, hoping to lose them. But they stayed on us, their engines growling like angry beasts. I could feel the heat of their lights on my back. Up ahead, I saw a narrow path leading into the woods. Without thinking, I swerved onto it, Emmett right behind me. The trees closed in, branches scratching at our faces and arms, but the riders didn't follow. We rode until we couldn't anymore, collapsing in a small clearing. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Emmett was shaking, his hands clenched tight around his handlebars. "What? What just happened?" I managed to ask. "I don't know," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "But we need to get out of here." We started walking our bikes, too tired to ride. The woods felt different now, like they were watching us. Every snap of a twig made me jump. After what felt like hours, we found a dirt road that led back to town. We didn't stop until we reached Emmett's house, slipping inside without waking his parents. Neither of us slept that night. The next day, we heard about a police raid near the quarry, something about a hidden camp and illegal activities, but they didn't mention the lights. Emmett moved away at the end of summer. We still text sometimes, but we don't talk about that night. It's like an unspoken rule. I still ride my bike sometimes, but never after dark. And I never go near the quarry. Some places are meant to stay hidden. Some things are better left alone. But every now and then, when the night is quiet and the moon is full, I think I see them, those lights dancing in the distance. And I remember how close we came to never coming back. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. Hi, my name is Callum. I'm 11 years old and usually pretty brave. My mom says I have a wild imagination, but what happened last summer wasn't just in my head. It was real. So real, I still get goosebumps just thinking about it. This story takes place at my cousin Owen's house. Owen is 2 years older than me and super smart. He loves science and always has some kind of experiment going on. His family had just moved into an old creaky house at the edge of a small town in Oregon. It was one of those houses that seemed like it had secrets hiding in the walls. Owen's parents were out of town for the weekend, so my mom let me stay over. It was supposed to be fun. We had pizza, watched a movie, and stayed up late playing video games. That was until we found the note. Owen and I were searching for batteries in the garage when I noticed a crumpled piece of paper under a wrench. Owen grabbed it and unfolded it. His dad's handwriting was messy but clear. "Had to leave early. Don't go in the basement, trust me. I'll explain later. Dad." Owen laughed it off, saying his dad was always paranoid. But me? I felt uneasy. Why would someone warn us about their own basement? "Let's check it out," Owen said with a mischievous grin. "I don't think that's a good idea," I muttered. "Come on, Callum. Don't chicken out. It's probably just old stuff down there." Now I should have known better. Every spooky story starts with kids going where they shouldn't, but I couldn't let Owen think I was scared. So I nodded, and we made our way to the basement door. Owen flicked on the light switch, but nothing happened. Great. The bulb was out. He grabbed a flashlight from a shelf and handed me a smaller one. We opened the door, and a cold draft hit us. The stairs creaked as we descended. The basement smelled damp, like wet wood and something metallic. The first thing we saw was a row of old shelves lined with jars. Some had screws and nails. Others had things I couldn't recognize, twisted pieces of metal in odd shapes that looked like they belonged in a junkyard. Owen's dad, Mr. Fisher, was a mechanic. He loved to tinker and fix things. But this was different. The tools on the wall weren't just hanging there. They were arranged in neat rows, each one inside a painted outline. Only, none of them matched. A screwdriver was in the spot for a hammer. A wrench hung where pliers should be. "That's weird," Owen whispered, running his hand over the outlines. Suddenly we heard it. Footsteps. Slow and steady, coming from behind us. We spun around, shining our flashlights. Nothing. The room was empty, but the sound continued, boots thudding softly against the wooden stairs. "Is someone there?" Owen called out. Silence. My flashlight flickered. I checked the battery, half full. Then the footsteps started again. Closer this time. "Maybe we should go back upstairs," I said, my voice shaking. Owen hesitated. Then he shrugged. "Okay, fine. Let's..." A scraping noise cut him off. It came from the far corner of the basement, behind a stack of old crates. We edged closer, our lights bobbing in the dark. The crates were strange. From a distance, they looked like wooden boxes, but up close, I saw the truth. They were metal, painted to look like wood. Owen knocked on one, and it made a hollow clang. "Why would my dad do this?" he whispered. "I don't know. Let's not stick around to find out." But Owen was already moving the crates aside. Behind them was a narrow gap in the wall, just wide enough to squeeze through. "Callum, look!" Owen whispered excitedly. "I don't want to look," I muttered, but I followed him anyway. We crawled through the gap and found ourselves in a small, hidden room. The walls were lined with more tools, strange ones I didn't recognize. In the center of the room stood a large machine. It looked like something out of a sci-fi movie, all gears and levers. Owen's eyes lit up. "This is incredible. My dad must be working on a secret project." "I think we should leave," I said. Before Owen could respond, the scraping noise started again. Louder, closer. The floor vibrated beneath us. "What's that?" Owen whispered. "I don't know, but I'm not sticking around to find out." We bolted back through the gap, stumbling over the crates. The footsteps had returned, echoing from the top of the stairs. They were faster now, almost running. We reached the staircase and raced up, slamming the door behind us. Owen locked it, and we collapsed against the wall, gasping for breath. For a moment, everything was quiet. Then, faintly, we heard the footsteps again. But this time, they weren't coming from the basement. They were in the hallway. "Owen," I whispered, "your dad better have a really good explanation." We never did find out what was down there. When Mr. Fisher came home, he just smiled and said, "It's not ready yet." I don't know what it was, but one thing's for sure, I'm never going back to that basement, ever.